I want to start off today's video with a question. If you will, I want you to think back into the history of human civilization. It can be any time from now to the beginning of recorded history. Now here's the question. What do you think is the biggest catalyst in history? In other words, what thing or act set off the biggest chain of events in our world as we know it? You could make the argument that everything throughout history is one big unfolding series of events that is laid into action by something before it, which it is. That being said, most people don't realize in the moment just how significant their actions are. Whether you know it or not, you have unknowingly impacted hundreds of people throughout your life, and you will continue to do so until you die. Actually, you'll likely influence people after you die as well. It's easy to look back throughout history with hindsight and realize that the generations before us were setting us up to prosper or fail. Like, for example, Percy Spencer, an engineer for Raytheon Technologies, was building a new military magnetron system when he noticed that the peanut candy bar that he had in his pocket had melted. Percy realized that he had been standing directly in front of an active radar set, and that the waves of radiation emitted from the radar generated enough heat to melt the peanut bar. Shortly after, Raytheon submitted the patent, and 2 years later began selling the Raytheon Radarange, the first commercial microwave oven. At the time, the 750-pound Radarange MSRP'd for around $3,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's around $41,605 in today's money. Today you can easily buy a microwave from Walmart for less than $60 and it weighs 20 pounds. So what exactly led to that happening? If you had to pick just one event, what would be the most likely culprit for kicking off the invention of the microwave? Maybe it was Percy Spencer. When he was 18, Percy enlisted himself into the United States Navy. While he was in the Navy, he single-handedly mastered all there was to know at the time on radio communications and the tech behind it. During his time in the military, Percy taught himself chemistry, physics, trigonometry, metallurgy, and other related subjects, reading textbooks while standing watch at night. By the late 30s, Percy Spencer had become one of the world's leading radar tube experts. Through his previous military experience and extensive knowledge of the technology, Percy was approached by Raytheon, a longtime contractor for the United States Department of Defense. During the Second World War, Percy played a massive role in the contracting and development of high-tech combat radar equipment for the Radiation Laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This boomed the progress that the institute was making and would be treated as the second highest priority project during World War II, second to the Manhattan Project, which, due to the success of their project, would absorb multiple scientists from the Radiation Laboratory to assist the US in the production of the first atomic bomb. After the war was over, Percy Spencer would remain employed by Raytheon, wherein he would discover and invent the first microwave. So you could say that the microwave was invented because of Percy's enlistment in the Navy, but passions and interests have to be piqued by something. The year that Percy joined the Navy just so happened to have been the same year as one of the most famous disasters in human history. On April 14th of that year, the sinking of the RMS Titanic made national headlines and turned heads from all across the globe. Of the ship's 2,200 passengers and crew, 1,500 people lost their lives to the icy waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. On April 14th at 11:12 p.m., Titanic's sister ship, the RMS Olympic, received the message that the ship had hit an iceberg. 3 hours later, after back-and-forth telegraphing, the Titanic sends out its last message: SOS, SOS, CQD, CQD, Titanic. We are sinking fast. Passengers are being put into boats. Titanic. The radio system that the Titanic was equipped with was a state-of-the-art 5-kilowatt radio set. The transmitter was so large and loud that it needed its own room so as to not create interference with the receiver. It was this exact set of radio equipment that piqued the interest of an 18-year-old Percy Spencer. Percy read about the radio set in an article and found it extremely fascinating. In just a few short years, Percy would be making radio systems that far and away surpassed the state-of-the-art technology in the Titanic's radio set. So if you really thought about it, the reason why we can eat a slice of leftover pizza in 1 minute instead of half an hour is all thanks to one of the most disastrous maritime accidents in the world. The Second World War was actually responsible for the invention and discovery of many objects that we now know as normal, everyday, sometimes even household items. The automatic teller machine, ballpoint pens, satellites, and superglue were all invented thanks to mankind's greatest conflict. But some inventions were more significant than others. While being able to write a letter upside down is nice, not having to die from an infection caused by something as small as a paper cut is considerably nicer. In 1928, Alexander Fleming was studying the properties of Staphylococci, a form of bacteria. Before leaving his laboratory for several days to go on a vacation to Suffolk, England with his family, Alexander left out a petri dish of Staphylococcus bacteria. When he returned, he discovered that the bacteria had begun to mold, but before throwing it out, he noticed that the mold had stopped the bacteria from growing. Alexander Fleming had accidentally discovered penicillin. Upon discovering this, he remarked, "That's funny." Over the next 10 years, Alexander tried desperately to prove that his discovery could revolutionize the medical industry and that penicillin could kill bacteria infections. It wasn't until 1940 that he developed a process that could successfully produce pure penicillin. That same year, Alexander set out with his team to prove the effectiveness of the drug by experimenting on 8 mice. All 8 mice were infected with a deadly Streptococcus bacteria, which we know today as strep throat. 4 mice were given penicillin and the other 4 were not. As you probably could guess, the 4 mice that were treated survived. The paper that Alexander wrote and published on his experiment gained immediate interest, and finally, penicillin was starting to turn heads. Now that doctors and scientists around the world knew about the effectiveness of penicillin in treating bacterial infections, the demand for the drug started booming. Even if the drug hadn't been tested on humans yet, the problem was that the production method for penicillin was slow, to say the least. Gallons of molded broth were only able to produce enough penicillin to fit on the end of your finger. In days, the majority of the Oxford laboratory had been turned into a factory producing penicillin. Even with the manpower, time, and resources allocated to the production of this new drug, only a few milligrams were produced each week. In 1941, the first human trial of penicillin was underway. Albert Alexander was a 43-year-old policeman who developed a dangerously life-threatening infection from a serious cut. Penicillin was administered and signs of improvement started to show. Unfortunately, Albert's infection came back and the doctors made a shocking discovery. There was not enough penicillin in the world to help him. 5 days later, Albert was dead. Months later, Dr. Howard Florey, a supervisor for the clinical trials, took to the US in hopes of speeding up production. Howard banded together a new team of scientists in Peoria, Illinois, wherein they discovered a new method of making penicillin. The lab that he set up in had a massive supply of corn steep liquor, which is a runoff of cornstarch. The team discovered that when the liquor was added to the mold broth, the yield of penicillin increased drastically. Howard and his team began seeking out soil samples that contained higher percentages of penicillin. After weeks of testing numerous samples, the solution was found right under their noses the whole time. An assistant at the lab found a rotting cantaloupe at the local market and brought it in. The team discovered that the mold on the cantaloupe produced 6 times more penicillin than Alexander Fleming's original method. Now that there was a much more efficient way of producing the world's latest miracle drug, Howard, Alexander, and their teams began reaching out to pharmaceutical companies in the United States about their new production strain for the new drug. At first, the companies were hesitant, but soon the United States would need more penicillin than they could get their hands on. In December of 1941, the United States joined the war, and the demand for penicillin skyrocketed. The war helped fully realize the effectiveness of penicillin as companies like Pfizer would begin sinking tons of resources into making massive amounts of penicillin. By 1943, the United States would have enough penicillin stocked to satisfy not just the needs of their military, but their allies as well. 3 years later, in 1946, penicillin would become publicly available and would change the world as we knew it. Before its invention, infections like gonorrhea, meningitis, blood poisoning, pneumonia, and rheumatic fever were practically death sentences. Since its creation, penicillin has saved an estimated 200 million lives. The first domino of the invention of penicillin is debatable, but I like to think it was Alexander Fleming and his family's vacation to Suffolk. Had he not taken that trip, the mold never would have had time to grow, thus he never would have made the discovery. It's totally possible that he would have discovered it later and somehow else, but it's also possible that he wouldn't have. Maybe someone else would have. Maybe if World War II wouldn't have happened, the demand for penicillin wouldn't have come fast enough, and the scientists would have given up and thought that maybe their discovery wasn't all that they had hyped it up to be. If World War II was the domino, it was a pretty massive domino. Everything that we've covered so far made them possible. It's impossible to say what the world would be like if World War II didn't happen, so here's an alternative. How could it have not happened? Well, World War II started with Adolf Hitler rising to power in Germany and trying to take over Europe as sort of a revenge for his country's defeat in the First World War. So the best way to ensure that the Second World War never happened is to ensure Hitler never happened, right? Well, there's a really good chance that someone else would have risen to power and done it themselves. After all, Hitler didn't create the Nazi Party. The most surefire way to ensure World War II didn't happen is easy. Make sure the first one didn't. Unlike the second, the First World War is really hard to pinpoint an exact reason as to why it started. There is, however, like everything we've talked about so far, a catalyst. The assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, the Duchess Sophie, is largely considered to be the thing that kicked off the Great War. Austria saw the assassination as an act of war on behalf of Serbia, as the assassin, Gavrilo Princip, was a Serbian radicalist. Austria declared war on Serbia, and a month later, Germany declared war on Serbia and all of its allies, Russia, France, Luxembourg, and Belgium. Great Britain would then declare war on Germany days later. So it was the assassination. The assassination of the Archduke was the thing that caused World War I, which directly led to World War II, which inadvertently led to the invention of the microwave and the discovery of penicillin. But why was he assassinated? Well, it's a complicated question. The simple answer is this. Gavrilo Princip, along with two other people, Nedeljko Kabrinovich and Trifko Gabrej, were a trio of radicalized teenagers that were set out to assassinate the Archduke in order to restore independence to Serbia, which had been under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These three teens were convinced that this was the only way to restore Serbia's great name and that they would be hailed as heroes, or martyrs. Each of them were given a handgun, bombs, and cyanide poisoning that they were instructed to take after the Archduke was confirmed as dead. After a wild series of events that I'll likely cover in a future video, the Archduke wound up being shot dead, along with his wife, by Gavrilo, the oldest of the three. The other two had failed miserably at their attempts and were arrested. They both died 2 years later in prison. Gavrilo died in 1918, also in prison. It's fascinating that World War I was technically caused by the actions of radicalized teenagers that were persuaded by older men of a radicalist party who were entrenched in their nationalistic views. There's a possibility, like everything else, that if Gavrilo Princip would never have existed, Franz Ferdinand never would have been assassinated, and the world wouldn't have been plunged into a war. But there's also a possibility that it still would have. Historians believe that it would have happened somehow, eventually, radical teenagers or not. What's interesting to me about history is that everything that ever has been or will be is a branching path that is determined by our decisions and our actions. We may not know how small or how large of an impact something that we do will create. It's not worth looking back on it and wondering what could have or should have happened, because we'll never know. You can either look at this as a way of living cautiously for the rest of your life, never taking a chance to do anything, fearing the consequences it may have on you or someone else. Or you can see this as a way of saying whatever happens, happens. It is what it is. After he discovered penicillin, Alexander Fleming said, "One sometimes finds what one is not looking for." I certainly didn't plan to revolutionize all medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic or bacteria killer, but I suppose that was exactly what I did. I think this quote is honestly a testament to history itself. You have no idea how significant your actions are until the fruits of your labor present themselves for everyone to see. Sometimes the result isn't what you were expecting or even hoping for. Sometimes it just happens. One day you're rising to power with the help of your friend, the next you're waging war against him and his armies, and you accidentally set humanity back by 1,000 years. Sometimes it's things we only see under a microscope. Sometimes it's things that are so large we have no idea how we didn't see it coming. Gavrilo Princip got to see the war rage on as he rotted in prison. He died in February of 1918 in his prison cell, nearly 4 years after the war started. He got to witness the world tear itself apart for seemingly no reason, and from behind the steel bars of a cell, I can't help but think that he likely thought that it was all his fault. I'm not feeling sorry for him in the slightest, I just wonder if he knew. Did he think, even for a second, that his actions would lead to the world as we know it today? Or was he actually so close-minded that he thought that it would likely only affect his country? It didn't matter. All three of the assassins were handed death sentences before they set out to carry out the deed, and I'm not talking about the cyanide pills. Months before the assassination, Each of the teens were diagnosed with tuberculosis, which, at the time, was a death sentence. When you have nothing to lose, everything that I've covered in this video becomes meaningless. It doesn't matter how big or small the impact is, because you're going to be dead soon. That is one of the most horrifyingly sobering thoughts I think anyone can have. So at the end of the day, the reason why you have a microwave in your home, the reason why you haven't died of a small scratch, and the reason why you're even watching this video, is this thing.